Modern animated villains often suck. That isn't exactly a controversial statement, as oftentimes villains in animated films are a far cry from what they used to be. Nowadays, there's a noticeable fixation on twist villains like Hans or misunderstood villains like Taka. What happened to the days of villains who were evil for evil's sake, unafraid to embrace their nastiness and went out of their way to be as bad as they could be, like Cruella, Gaston, and Hades? But every now and then we get a villain like Jack Horner, who's the perfect example of what a villain should be.
You're not gonna shoot a puppy, are you, Jack?
Yeah, in the face. Why?
So what separates a modern villain that doesn't work from one that actually does? And how do you write a modern villain that doesn't suck? To understand how, we need to understand 4 key components that are needed to write about a villain like Jack Horner, and the first being motivation. Number 1, motivation. One of the biggest ways Jack stands out amongst the other villains of his era is motivation. Believe it or not, Horner's entire drive in the film is incredibly straightforward. Sometimes simple motivations are seen as weak or underwritten, but when utilized correctly, they can be highly effective. Especially when many fairly recent animated villains have had motivations that turn out to be far too convoluted and are held off from exploring just so the film can have a big twist near the end. Some characters who fall into these trappings include the aforementioned Hans from Frozen or Bellwether from Zootopia. Their motivations feel less personal and character drive only coming to light in order to throw audiences for a loop, because their motivations are kept hidden for most of the film. It greatly affects the impact their presence has on the film for the first 2 acts. And as time has gone on, it wasn't the straightforward one-note villains that went on to be seen as huge cliches. It's the villains whose villainy is explicitly hidden. Part of what makes Jack such a fun and refreshing villain is because of how straightforward he is.
These babies are gonna get me that wish even after the whole team is dead and gone.
Once known as Little Jack Horner, the son of a baker embraced an inferiority complex he had towards magical creatures and decided to become a crime lord hell-bent on acquiring all the magical items he could. In a world of magical creatures, he wants to be the ruler over all magic, hoarding immense amounts of power to himself. To put it bluntly, he wants the magic so no one else can have it. It's the mindset of a spoiled child who hasn't been taught the value of sharing just yet.
For me, no one else gets any.
There's no tragic backstory, no sympathetic angle the film tries to take. He's just a bad guy, and for this movie, that's more than enough. That's not to say he's flat or completely one note. However, as the idea of a spoiled child growing into a spoiled man isn't exactly a foreign concept to today's world, you may not learn the most nuanced or layered lesson from a character like this, but that's okay. Jack Horner serves his purpose perfectly because he shares the role of antagonist with another, Death. But Death is a bit less of a typical villain, as he isn't always the direct physical threat to Puss and his friends. He represents a greater character flaw in Puss that haunts him throughout the film and ultimately drives him to seek out the wishing star. But he isn't the one usually putting his life in danger. That responsibility falls on Jack, and because he's made to be straightforward and easy to digest from the get-go, it makes him perfect for the role of consistent threat throughout the film.
I pronounce this batch delicious.
His narrow intentions gives the film a solid structure to work the plot around, while Death's presence helps to make it deeper and more nuanced. And since Death isn't the prototypical villain who wishes for absolute carnage, that gives Jack Horner free reign to be as evil as the film wants him to be. Number 2, evil. The concept of a truly evil animated villain has been somewhat lost over the years. Most likely that style of villain began to fall out of favor as it didn't really give a movie the opportunity to be more reflective of real life. Despite what fairy tales and folklore would have us believe, there isn't really a true good or true evil in the world. There are differing shades of gray that come from differing views in morality, with no real steadfast right or wrong instilled by the universe, but rather by civilized society. What one person views as evil could be viewed as good in another's eyes, and vice versa. And modern animated films have often tried to create their villains around that mentality, crafting antagonists that are troubled, tragic, or misunderstood. Take Taka from Moana, for example. The giant lava monster that's on a warpath to destroy the Earth is actually just the corrupted form of the peaceful goddess Te Fiti. There's always something written in to excuse the villainy, but not with Jack Horner. The guy is unabashedly, unapologetically evil.
What a good boy am I.
Jack doesn't just do bad, he relishes in it. In fact, it might be the only thing he really knows how to do. Everything he says and does is laced with such malice and discontent for other living things, and it doesn't matter if you're his enemy or ally. This can be seen in his introductory scene where he fulfills the deal he made with the Serpent Sisters to steal the map to the Wishing Star. They did everything they promised to do, and Jack makes good on his promise to pay them their weight in gold. Of course, this is made possible by turning one of the sisters into solid gold with the power of the Midas touch.
Oh no, I misjudged the situation!
While I guess you could say he didn't exactly lie, his willingness to pretty much off someone who helped him really does speak to his character, but the Serpent Sisters were just guns for hire. Surely he treats his employees with a little bit more respect and care? Well, that may be wishful thinking. Multiple times throughout the film, Jack is shown to have very little regard for the men and women he brought along with him on his journey. Whether it be through feeding them to man-eating plants or using them as a human bridge over a chasm, Jack makes it very clear that he sees his helping hands as disposable pawns rather than actual people. And the thing is, he won't hide his true feelings about that. Whether he's being called an irredeemable monster by the Jimmy Cricket knockoff, or even admitting that he himself is dead inside, Jack is always fully embracing the evil that's inside him, and he does it all with a smile on his face.
These babies are gonna get me that wish even after the whole team is dead and gone.
While it may be a bit extreme to call Jack the total embodiment of evil, he's still a complete sociopath, but he's portrayed in such a way that manages to be funny as well as frightening. Number 3, execution. And a lot of the reason why a villain like this works so well comes down to the execution for the character. A villain can have a cool concept or idea that they embody, but if the execution is off, the whole thing ultimately falls apart. It can be visual issues like the design, or a miscast voice actor, or a narrative failure like tonal mismatch, or just a complete lack of presence in the film. Those factors can lead to differing outcomes of memorability. Just look at the difference between Governor Ratcliffe from Pocahontas and Clayton from Tarzan. Both are very similar characters in ideas and motivations, but the execution of both characters turns out to be night and day, with history making it clear who went on to be fondly remembered for years. Well, as much as you can fondly remember a gorilla killer. And judging by the outpouring of enjoyment that's come from the release of The Last Wish, it's safe to say that the execution of Jack Horner is pulled off wonderfully. Let's take a look at Jack from a conceptual point of view. He's an arrogant man-child that held on to his childish ways and never really grew up into a well-functioning adult. This is reflected in his design, which is a mix of both childlike traits and menacing adult features.
Little Jack's dead. I'm Big Jack Horner.
His oversized body and small head further drives home his immaturity, giving him exaggerated childish proportions. But his large towering body also gives him a sense of menace, strength, and power. It's essentially the visualization of a baby with a machine gun. The baby itself isn't a threat, but with the unruly power of a machine gun in its hands, it becomes a nightmare that can't be reasoned with or swayed like you could a regular adult. It's also a great visualization for the gluttonous greed Jack embodies. Like we said, Jack wants all of the world's magic to himself, much like a greedy child that's unwilling to share his birthday cake. There's also a touch of regality to his look, what with the emphasis on purple and pink in his attire. This reflects his wealthy upbringing, which would later give birth to his narcissistic and selfish ways. Without even knowing anything about Jack, you could take one look at his design and deduce a pretty ballpark understanding of what he's all about. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention the stellar vocal performance from comedian and actor John Mulaney, who absolutely nails the whiny, self-entitled aura this character needed to have.
Can't bake a pie without losing a dozen men.
A lot of his comedic lines are delivered with a dryness that only enhances the comedy, while he also gets several moments of gleeful viciousness as he terrorizes anyone that lays in his wake. But while this is very much a comedic character, certainly more so than Death in this film, he's never played as a full-on joke. The film remembers to legitimize him through his acts of violence and his disregard for any lives that stand in front of him. And yet he's wildly entertaining to watch, never dragging the film down when the story decides to cut to him. In fact, you could say his scenes actually enhance the film, giving it a cynical but dryly hilarious voice that makes it seem distinct from other animated films of the time.
I don't mean it metaphorically or rhetorically or poetically or theoretically or in any other fancy way. I'm deaf, straight.
Most importantly, the way Jack Horner is used never sacrifices the tension of the story. While nearly everything he says is pretty hilarious, it never comes at the cost of undermining the film's stakes. This can be a very tricky balance to strike for a film that wants to be a riveting action-adventure movie and also a comedy, but the execution of Jack Horner allows the film to succeed in that regard with flying colors. Number 4, representation. So even though Jack Horner is a straightforward evil, well-designed foil for the film's heroes, what makes him stand out among the pack is just how he ties into the themes of the film. A weak villain goes through an entire film without really playing a meaningful or impactful role in the growth of our protagonist. But they still need to be a physical threat, which is a trend some modern animated movies have strayed away from. In an effort to have villains be more misunderstood or more layered, some newer villains have come to represent only the internal struggle of the hero. A good example of this is Ming Li in Turning Red. She's not a villain in a traditional sense, but her imposing of cultural norms and unwillingness to loosen the leash she has on her daughter ends up being a direct manifestation of all the anxiety Mei Ling feels. The conflict between the two becomes more emotional than physical, which can be fine in some scenarios, but lacks a bit of the physicality that makes other villains so memorable. A good villain is not only supposed to push our hero physically, but in a deeper, perhaps metaphysical way. Jack Horner does just that. On the most basic surface level way to view him, he is the constant roadblock that threatens to keep Puss in Boots from acquiring the wishing star. And while he threatens Puss physically and threatens the lives of not only him but Puss's friends, there is some more to the two's relationship. Both want the same thing, and though Jack's desires are definitely more extreme, their wants actually run quite parallel to one another. Jack represents uncontrolled greed and insatiable desire to have more than he will ever need and far more than he really deserves. And in a way, Puss in Boots threatens to fall into that mindset as well. Terrified of death both physically and theoretically, Puss seeks to extend his own life far beyond what fate had intended for him. He's grasping at the chance to go against the natural order for his own gain, but over time he begins to realize the true value of life isn't how long you can make it last, it's how you ultimately spend it. This is absolutely a foreign concept to Jack, who won't be satisfied until he has everything he wants, or at least so he thinks.
I never had much as a kid. Just loving parents. Stability in a mansion.
Jack makes it clear from the beginning that he had everything he could ever need: a loving family, a thriving business, and ludicrous amounts of money. And yet it seemingly never made him happy, and he deluded himself into believing that if he just had more, he would finally be satisfied. Deep down, he might even know this, but has become so blinded by that greed that he possibly never would have realized it. Another significant note about Jack's inclusion in the film is how well he contributes to representing the spectrum of antagonists in the film. To borrow a little inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons, characters are often slotted into a certain dichotomy through an alignment chart. While the columns of said chart usually run through the spectrum of good and evil, let's instead look at the three pillars that run horizontally in the chart: lawful, neutral, and chaotic. If you were to look at the three characters who you could consider antagonists in the film, Death, Goldilocks, and Jack Horner, you can see that all three almost perfectly represent the entire spectrum. Death falls into lawful territory as he is more of a force of nature rather than an individual. While he may have his own wants and desires, he only acts while following the laws of nature, hunting down Puss in Boots, not because he wants to kill him, but simply because his time has come. Then there's Goldilocks, who falls into the neutral territory. Her motivations are more self-fulfilling, wanting to use the wishing star to find her biological family. However, she possesses the ability to be swayed out of those desires, which is eventually what happens when she realizes her bear family is the only family she ever needed. She acts on selfish desires but can be reasoned with. And then there's Jack, who completely fulfills the other end of the alignment spectrum: chaos. Everywhere Jack goes brings death and destruction with him, which happens to elevate the stakes in the film by injecting pure chaos into every encounter. He can't be reasoned with, but not in a way like Death, where he's bound to the rules of nature. He doesn't want to reason. He only wishes to bring suffering to others and doesn't care how many lives he ruins in his pursuits. Together, all three antagonists could cover the entire spectrum of what a villain can be, with Jack Horner being the most capital V villain of them all. In a film many have considered perfect, Jack Horner stands as one of the features that make the movie just that great. He is perhaps one of the very true embodiments of classic villainy we've seen in a long time, fully embracing evil and villainy in an unshamed way in an era of film and television that almost seems hesitant to go all the way. There is no redemption, appeal to emotions, or understanding to be had here, just a guy who's bad and loves it. But just because the character of Jack Horner can be seen as simple does not mean he can be considered shallow. Sometimes a villain who is the absolute embodiment of all they represent is more than enough to make their time in a film memorable. And that's exactly what Jack does. Big Jack Horner won't be remembered like the other villains of the modern age. He's not tragic, he's not redeemable, heck, he's hardly even human. But he will be remembered for being hilarious, intimidating, and the purest distillation of villainy we've seen in a long while.